unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Sri Lanka has been the site of dramatic economic and political upheaval over the past several weeks, as years of economic mismanagement have resulted in rampant inflation, shortages of essential commodities, and the country's first sovereign default in the post-independence era. The island's dire economic conditions have spurred angry and sometimes violent protests, which resulted in the sudden resignation of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and continued calls for the resignation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the country's president and the Prime Minister's brother. To discuss the economic and political causes and consequences of this crisis, I'm joined on the show today by political economist Ahilan Kadirgamar. Ahilan is the honorary chairman of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank and senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna. I am pleased to welcome him to the show from his home in Jaffna. Ahilan, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan.
So, first of all, it goes without saying, we hope that you, your family, your friends are safe. We know from what we've been reading in the press and seeing on television, the situation on the ground has been quite fluid. The scenes coming out of Sri Lanka have been very difficult to watch. You know, we're seeing soaring levels of inflation, a near total wipeout of foreign exchange reserves, shortages, as I said earlier, of medical supplies and of food, and sustained street protests that have often turned violent. I'm just wondering if maybe we could start by giving us a sense of, you know, what is life like right now on the ground in the country?
For ordinary people, it's been very difficult times. Over the last number of months, there's been shortages of essential goods. Even medicines are in short supply. The price of rice and bread have doubled. Petrol, diesel, and even cooking gas prices have doubled, and it's in short supply, with people having to stand in queues for hours to be able to get them. So it's been very difficult for people in terms of their day-to-day lives. And for students, for youth, they've not been able to focus on their education because of all these day-to-day challenges.
And tell us about the protests. I mean, have they been bad in Jaffna? Have they gotten out of control? Has there been violence?
The protests have been mounting all over the country, but they've been focused much more outside the north. The north itself, because there was a long civil war, and the north remained militarized after that. So it's only the mobilized constituencies that come out for these kinds of protests. And so we don't see the kind of spontaneous protests that we are seeing in the rest of the country. But the resentment among the people is countrywide. They feel the government has really mismanaged the economy, and there is a lot of anger about the leadership.
You know, I think many people who watch developments in South Asia have long held very serious concerns about Sri Lanka's political climate. Obviously, you mentioned the many decades-long civil war, but many of those watchers have perhaps been insufficiently focused on the country's economic foundations. Of course, it's easy to look at things in hindsight, but with the benefit of hindsight, you know, is it possible for you to sort of pinpoint the origins of Sri Lanka's current economic woes?
Yeah, the immediate cause is also partly the war in Ukraine, where global commodity prices have gone up. So we are not able to finance our fuel bill, for example. The pandemic had its impact. We get quite a bit of earnings from tourism. And as of 2020, the entire tourism sector was disrupted. And then soon after the election of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he reduced taxes. So our state revenues have been very low. And in a way, the public are blaming this government for not having addressed this situation and resolved the crisis. But in reality, the causes of this crisis go back much longer. It has to do with our economic foundations itself. Sri Lanka was colonized for close to 4.5 centuries, and our economy has always been one of a dependent economy. And since the 1970s, even though we opened up our economy, what we call open economy reforms here, we were dependent on a few export sectors or a few sectors from which we earned our foreign earnings. And when we liberalized trade, we were not able to pay for the imports with those few exports. So tea has traditionally been our main export earner from colonial times. But over the last few decades, the garment industry has been another important one. And then, of course, people going and working as migrant workers, particularly in the Middle East, first as domestic housemaids, and then for all kinds of other blue collar work. That's been an important income earner. But without self sufficiency in food and having opened up our economy for imports, we've been through repeated balance of payment problems. And I think that's at the crux of the problem, where over the last decade and a half, we were paying for our import bill with foreign debt. And right now, we are really caught in a foreign debt crisis.
So I want to ask you about this debt crisis because there is a widely circulating narrative that Sri Lanka is particularly caught up in a debt trap that is largely due to the fact that it's borrowed excessively from the Chinese and now does not have the hard currency to repay those loans. Some economists said this is very lazy analysis because China is owed only about 10%, some estimates say, of the country's debt stock as of last year. How would you characterize the China factor here? Is it as important as some analysts have claimed?
Yeah, as a percentage of our foreign debt, debt to China is only 10%. Debt to Japan is another 10%. The bulk of our debt, over 40%, are sovereign bonds that we have gone and borrowed in the international capital markets. And the interest at which we borrow in these capital markets are very high, on the average of 7.5%. So when we repay these sovereign bonds after 10 years, as we are trying to this year, the interest cost is almost equivalent to the principal. So we have to double the amount. So there's no returns on that sort of investment. Now, the question about China, it is also a geopolitical one. But what is important there is that Sri Lanka has not been setting its development path on its own terms. Whether it's trade and financial liberalization policies that have been pushed by the World Bank and the IMF, whether it's development assistance from many of our bilateral donors, we've been inviting any project without considering the returns on it. And I think that is the reason why we are caught in this debt trap. And China is one of the actors, but not responsible for this crisis per se.
One of the other actors that comes into the picture here when you're talking about the Sri Lankan economy, of course, is the International Monetary Fund. Sri Lanka has a long, somewhat complicated history with the IMF. Once more, Sri Lanka is in talks with the IMF about how it might resolve this current economic crisis. What conversations are government officials having with the fund? Does any potential deal have a fighting chance at actually improving what is, again, a very grim and complicated economic situation?
Sri Lanka has gone through 16 IMF agreements since 1965. The most recent two agreements. One in 2016, where we went for an extended fund facility of 1.5 billion US dollars. And before that, soon after the war in 2009, for a 2.6 billion standby arrangement. So now again, we are at the doorstep of the IMF for another agreement, but this time around, we are much more desperate. Our foreign reserves have almost dwindled to a few million US dollars. We cannot even seem to pay for the next shipment of fuel, even if the ship is at our port. So it is in that kind of a desperate situation that we have turned to the IMF. In fact, Sri Lanka is going to every country and every donor to try to get some foreign exchange to be able to import these essential items which are in short supply. But this time around, Sri Lanka has no negotiating power with the IMF. We are completely at its mercy. The IMF conditions, which are possibly the same recommendations that have come about in its staff report, which was made public in March. And that those recommendations call for fiscal consolidation, or in other words, austerity. And that's going to be really problematic in the case of Sri Lanka, because the reason for these protests is the huge rising costs and the burden on the people. And if the government is forced to impose further austerity, it's only going to increase the burden on the people. So to what extent the IMF is going to continue to push for these kinds of conditionalities is in question. But in a way, Sri Lanka has already taken the path, because we are already implementing many of these recommendations of the IMF. But the IMF, may not give all the funds necessary to get us out of this debt problem. I think the idea is that once we have an IMF agreement, we will be able to borrow from other multilateral agencies and possibly even go back and borrow in the capital markets to create the liquidity and keep our debt solvent. But the global conditions are such that with the Fed raising interest rates, with the disorder in the global markets, with the war in Ukraine, the scenario of borrowing more from the capital markets seem unlikely. And in that context, I worry that the IMF agreement is not going to solve this problem. In fact, a year later or 2 years down the line, we might be in this muddle, going from one IMF agreement to another, even as the economic crisis deepens in Sri Lanka.
You talked about what other countries might offer. This is perhaps as good a segue as any to talk about the role that India is playing. India has offered to extend Sri Lanka a significant line of credit. News reports suggest India is also providing essential humanitarian relief. I don't need to tell you that India has had a somewhat rocky relationship with the island in recent years, especially during periods of Rajapaksa rule. Does the present moment offer a chance, do you think, for India to somehow reset its equation with Colombo? Are we seeing any signs of some kind of new equation on that front?
Over the last few months in particular, India has been quite generous in terms of credit lines to help ease the economic situation in Sri Lanka, at least to get some of these essential goods in. And that's, I think, been welcomed by the people. The rocky relationship with India, it really aggravated in the late 1970s when Sri Lanka took the liberalization path and away from the non-aligned movement when India was aligned with the Soviet Union. And that eventually got muddled in the civil war that started in 1983. And in 1987, there was an Indian intervention with boots on the ground as peacekeeping forces. So that is what left a really sour relationship with particularly the Sinhala community, the majority Sinhala community in Sri Lanka, which, even though it's a majority in Sri Lanka, it has a minority mindset given this large power next to us. And even the Tamil community, even though the Tamil community in Sri Lanka is indigenous to Sri Lanka, there is uh, over 80 million Tamils in India. And so the Sinhala community always sees itself as a minority in the region and with fears. So this is, I think, a moment, this is an opportunity for India to reset its relationship with Sri Lanka, not by muscling in politically, but through social and economic support when Sri Lanka is going through perhaps its most difficult period since independence.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I do want to talk about the politics for a second, not from an India perspective, but really from a Sri Lankan one. We saw on May 9th the Prime Minister finally giving in to calls for him to resign from office. This was really a massive climb down for a politician who has been president, Prime Minister, has had, some would say, a larger-than-life impact on politics on the island, especially over the last couple of decades. His brother, Gotabaya, still remains president for now, but the calls for his resignation too are getting louder. For those who are not so familiar with this family, give us a sense of the Rajapaksas, the role that they've played in Sri Lankan politics over the last decade. And is there a role for them, do you think, in the post-crisis future of the country?
The Rajapaksas, even though they have been in politics since the 1970s, certainly this generation of them, and even earlier with Mahinda Rajapaksa's father, they really came into the limelight in the mid 2000s when the civil war was still raging. There was an internationalized peace process initiated by, at that time, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe in 2002. And when he tried to combine the peace process with further neoliberal reforms, slowly a backlash emerged in the South, a Sinhala nationalist backlash, so to speak. And Rajapaksa, with the support of such forces, managed to defeat Ranil Wickremesinghe in the presidential elections of 2005. And that set the path for almost the emergence of a dynastic politics. He brought in his brothers into politics soon after, and his brother, who is currently the president, was the defense secretary at that time, and they were able to crush the Tamil Tigers. And this long, protracted civil war, having won it, gave them a legacy of having defeated what was considered a very powerful armed group, even internationally, the Tamil Tigers. So people assumed that they would be in politics for the next few decades. And during his second term from 2010 to 2015, Mahinda Rajapaksa set development as his target, made deals with China, went and borrowed extensively in the international capital markets, and started to build massive infrastructure and development projects, and started to neglect the social base that had initially brought him to power. And as economic life became harder for that base, they were finally thrown out in 2015. But by then, their supporters in many positions in government were well entrenched. And even though a new government with Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and President Sirisena tried to govern the country, infighting in that government and neglect of a drought-ridden economy led to the comeback of the Rajapaksas when they formed their own party, SLPP. Until then, they were part of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which was during the previous government under the control of President Sirisena. So they formed their own party and overnight had landslide victories in the local government elections in 2018. And then there were the Easter attacks of 2019, these ISIS-inspired attacks, which allowed the Rajapaksas then to come back to power in the presidential election. So the war, security, the military, along with their Sinhala Buddhist nationalist base, have been the foundations of the Rajapaksas. Though in their most recent comeback in 2019, they also got a lot of support from the business community, thinking that they were the doers. Now, that whole illusion has been shattered over the last year. And this opposition to the Rajapaksas has been mounting over the last 2 years, because once they came to power 2.5 years ago, they were only interested in consolidating power. They brought about constitutional amendments to increase the powers of the president. They pushed through the Colombo Port City bill. The Colombo Port City is a project being built by China as a financial city on reclaimed land. So they were only focused on their own interests and disregard the public concerns, even though the public was really suffering with the COVID pandemic. If you even compare with the rest of South Asia, in 2020, Sri Lanka spent the least in terms of addressing the COVID pandemic. We only spent about 0.8% of our GDP on COVID-related expenditure, whereas the rest of South Asia spent anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5% of GDP. So there was mounting anger among the public even at that period. And about a year ago, the protests were starting to increase. The fear of the sort of authoritarian face of the president was also crumbling as the anger became widespread. So this is something that has been in the works over 2 years now. And the most recent movement and the protests, and particularly what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, has made it amply clear that the Rajapaksas have no future. Imagine a president who was considered to be invincible, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and then who became prime minister, now in hiding in a naval base somewhere. So it's very hard for this wounded regime to come back. I think now they're fighting for their survival and safety.
You mentioned that Sri Lanka, of course, has a legacy of political violence. The Rajapaksas are intimately connected to that, given the events of the last decade plus. We've seen in this current series of events protesters being brutally attacked by pro-regime forces, protesters who are also then, in exchange, targeting government personnel, property, because they're simply exasperated with the desperate economic situation. What kind of violence is playing out in the streets today? Are you worried of further escalation and a kind of descent into the kinds of political violence that has plagued the country in the past?
Yeah, Sri Lanka has gone through not only a civil war, which was an ethnic conflict, but we also had 2 major insurrections in the south, that is within the Sinhala community. Sinhala youth rising up against the state in 1971, and then again from 1988 to 1990. The second one was very brutal. Over 50,000 people were killed. Youth were massacred. So we have that very tragic history. What was remarkable with these protests was that they were mostly peaceful until a week ago. Last Friday, there was a complete shutdown of the country by what we call a hartal, a form of a general strike, but also the closing down of all businesses and shops and so on to show that the people were not going to work with the government. And that led to the president announcing that the prime minister will resign on Monday. And what the prime minister did, and it still baffles many of us, he called his supporters to Temple Trees, the famous residence of the prime minister, and then told them that he was going to leave office. But also, it seemed that he set them off to walk over and attack and smash these peaceful protests, which is what led to this backlash, a massive reaction of particularly the Rajapaksas and other ruling party members of parliament's houses being torched in many parts in the south of the country. So violence has been contained, and since that uh, night of torching, it's again been somewhat peaceful. So it was this provocation by the government and its supporters that led to this backlash. So while it's been contained so far, I worry that the country is descending into some form of anarchy without a proper leadership, without a legitimate president ruling the country, somebody that people no longer respect or want in power. This is a very worrying situation. And unless we bring about some amount of political and economic stability, what I mean by a state of anarchy is that crime can increase, a gang culture can take hold. Those kinds of problems that come with abject poverty can also emerge in the country, even if it's not organized forms of insurrection and insurrectionary violence.
Ahilan, you've been so generous with your time. I don't want to keep you much longer, but I do have one final question I'd like to ask you. Sri Lanka has often been held up as an example of the dangers of ethnic majoritarianism. In that way, it offers, I think, many lessons for India, given the current state of that country's politics, but that's perhaps for a different episode. I'm curious how the current crisis, if at all, maps onto existing deep-seated cleavages that exist between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority.
Now, while there was a long ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, over the last decade in particular, the Rajapaksas and their supporters focused on attacking the Muslim community, drawing on a kind of global Islamophobic discourse and also drawing on developments in the region. They tried to make the Muslim community the enemy, and there were acts of violence, even pogroms against the Muslim community. What has been really encouraging about the protest movement over the last couple months is that it's been multi-ethnic. On Golface Green, where the Occupy movement has taken hold, we are seeing all ethnic communities come together and working together and protesting together. So this is a great progressive moment. But they're also asking for a credible political solution and an economic way forward out of the suffering that people are facing. My worry is that even though now the Rajapaksas are on their way out, they don't have a future, and politics in Sri Lanka is swinging again towards the liberal spectrum. If the liberals don't address this crisis properly, if going to the IMF means further austerity and putting the burden further on people, the pendulum can again swing, as we've seen in Sri Lankan politics. From time to time, it swings from one direction to the other. And this time, again, it could be to some kind of divisive politics. Even a fascist regime could emerge. Sri Lankan politics is very different from the rest of the region. We've never had a military coup. It's always been democratic and it's always been through people's movements. But in those people's movement, it can also get very ethnicized. So right now we have a great progressive opening, but if we don't address it correctly, if it is manipulated for the interests of some actors, then there can also be a backlash. That is what we saw after the major protests of 1953, when Sri Lanka went towards Sinhala-only policies. That's what we saw with liberalization in the late 1970s, which then eventually swung towards the ethnic conflict. And in 2002, when there was a great opening and hope of peace, but then again it swung towards the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and the emergence of the Rajapaksa regime. And I worry that if we don't use this opportunity now, any liberal regime that comes to power is only focused on the same path of economic development that has led to great inequalities in the country. We might again see a rural upsurge. And this time, again, it might be through divisive ethnic politics. And I worry that it won't be the Rajapaksas this time, but it might be an even more fascist regime that emerges in the future.
My guest on the show this week is Ahilan Kadirgamar. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna and one of Sri Lanka's leading political economists. He is also the author of just a terrific piece on Sri Lankan politics called Polarization, Civil War, and Persistent Majoritarianism in Sri Lanka that was published in 2020, actually as part of a Carnegie Endowment compilation co-edited by my colleague Tom Carruthers. It is just a truly insightful glimpse into the last several decades of Sri Lankan politics. Ahilan, I know that you faced quite a number of obstacles on the ground itself. I should mention to our listeners that we're recording this via cell phone because there have been persistent power cuts throughout the country. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights with me, and hope that you and your family and friends continue to be safe.
Thank you for having me.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.